Charles Grayson woke to the sound of his penthouse's automated curtains gliding open, revealing a panoramic view of the city skyline. The morning light filtered in, casting long shadows across the sleek modern furniture that filled his spacious living room. Everything in Charles's life was designed for efficiency, from the silent, robotic movements of his personal assistant to the precisely calibrated temperature in his bedroom. Yet, as he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, he felt a familiar hollowness settle over him. The routine was always the same. He slid out of bed, the cool marble floor greeting his feet, and made his way to the gym. The machines there were state-of-the-art, each one tailored to his exact physical needs. His workout was efficient, every movement calculated for maximum benefit. But as he lifted weights and ran on the treadmill, his mind drifted, unable to shake the feeling that something was missing. After a shower that was more a ritual than a necessity, Charles dressed in a crisp suit and headed to the dining area. His breakfast was laid out meticulously, an egg white omelet, avocado slices, and a green smoothie, all prepared by his private chef. He ate in silence, the only sound the faint hum of the city outside. Despite the perfection of his surroundings, the food tasted bland, as if devoid of flavor. As he scrolled through his phone, checking emails and stock reports, his thumb paused over an old photo buried in his gallery. It was a picture from years ago, his brother Thomas standing beside him at a family barbecue, both of them smiling, carefree. Charles quickly swiped past it, the image vanishing as quickly as it appeared. There was no time for distractions. The drive to his office was as smooth and predictable as ever. His driver navigated the city's traffic with ease, the car's interior cocooning Charles from the noise and bustle outside. He barely noticed the passing buildings, his mind already on the meetings and decisions that awaited him. It was during his morning jog, a habit he maintained to keep himself sharp, that his routine was unexpectedly disrupted. As he ran through an upscale neighborhood, focusing on his breathing, a small voice broke through the quiet. "I know you," the voice called out. Charles slowed, glancing around until he spotted a young boy, no more than 7 years old, standing on the sidewalk with wide, inquisitive eyes. "I found your photos in my daddy's box." Charles, caught off guard, stopped. The boy's gaze was intense, filled with a mixture of excitement and curiosity that Charles couldn't quite place. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his tone more brusque than intended. But the boy, Noah, as he soon introduced himself, was undeterred. "My daddy has pictures of you from a long time ago." Charles felt a flicker of something, confusion, perhaps curiosity. "Your father?" he asked, frowning. Noah nodded eagerly, his face lighting up. "You have to come see. Please, come with me." For a moment, Charles considered brushing the boy off and continuing his run, but something in Noah's earnestness, his unwavering belief that this was important, made Charles pause. Against his better judgment, he nodded, allowing himself to be led away, wondering what on earth this could be about. Noah's small hand tightened around Charles's as they walked through a neighborhood that felt both foreign and eerily familiar. The city's gleaming skyscrapers gave way to aging apartment buildings, their facades weathered and cracked, a stark contrast to the pristine luxury of Charles's penthouse. Each step closer to their destination stirred something deep within him, a feeling he hadn't allowed himself to confront in years. The building they arrived at was one of the older ones, its brick exterior faded from years of neglect. Noah led Charles inside, the narrow hallway dimly lit by flickering lights. The musty smell of old carpet filled the air as they climbed the creaking stairs to the 3rd floor. Charles felt a strange sense of déjà vu as they approached a door marked 3B. He hesitated, a distant memory tugging at the edges of his consciousness. But before he could grasp it, Noah was knocking on the door. A moment later, it opened to reveal a man Charles hadn't seen in over a decade, his younger brother, Thomas Grayson. The years had been hard on Thomas. His face was lined with weariness, his hair tinged with gray, and his clothes were worn but clean. The sight of him hit Charles like a punch to the gut, stirring a mix of emotions he wasn't prepared for. "Charles?" Thomas's voice was rough, as if disuse had left it strained. For a long moment, neither brother spoke. They simply stood there, staring at each other, the air thick with the weight of unspoken words. Charles took in the details of his brother's appearance, the exhaustion in his eyes, the resilience in the way he held himself. The contrast between them couldn't have been more stark. Thomas, with his worn-out demeanor, was a far cry from the sharp, confident man Charles had become. But it wasn't just physical. There was a life lived in Thomas's eyes that Charles couldn't ignore. Noah broke the silence with a bright, "Daddy, look! I found him!" His excitement was a jarring contrast to the tension between the two men. Thomas nodded slowly, as if still processing the reality of Charles standing in his doorway. "Come in," he finally said, stepping aside to let Charles enter. The apartment was modest, the kind of place Charles hadn't set foot in for years. The living room was small but clean, with mismatched furniture and walls adorned with faded photographs. As Charles looked around, the familiarity of the place began to sink in. This was the kind of home they had grown up in, simple, unadorned, and filled with the warmth of family. Yet here, the warmth was replaced by a lingering sadness, a life marked by struggle. Standing in the middle of the room, Charles found himself overwhelmed by memories. Suddenly, the walls around him seemed to dissolve, and he was a child again, building forts with Thomas in the backyard, their laughter echoing in the summer air. They were inseparable then, two brothers who faced the world together. He remembered sneaking into the kitchen for midnight snacks, whispering so their parents wouldn't hear, and the way Thomas had always looked up to him, trusting him implicitly. But those memories quickly shifted. He saw them as teenagers, their bond fraying as life took them down different paths. Petty arguments grew into larger conflicts, driven by Charles's growing ambition and Thomas's desire for a simpler, more honest life. Their once solid connection began to crack under the strain, until one day it shattered completely. The final memory came unbidden, a bitter argument on the night Charles had decided to leave for college. Thomas had accused him of abandoning the family, of being too consumed by his ambitions to care about what really mattered. Charles, fueled by a mix of anger and pride, had walked away without looking back. It was the last time they had spoken before the long years of silence set in. As the memories faded, Charles was pulled back to the present by the sound of Thomas's voice. "It's been a long time," Thomas said quietly, his tone heavy with the weight of the years between them. Charles nodded, unable to find the right words. The room felt suffocating, filled with the ghosts of their past. It was then that Charles noticed a name he hadn't thought of in years, Roger Whitman. A framed article on the wall mentioned a failed business venture, a partnership between Roger and Thomas that had ended disastrously. Charles remembered Roger well. He had been Charles's mentor, the man who had guided him into the world of business. But he also remembered how Roger had sown the seeds of doubt between the brothers, playing on Charles's ambitions and insecurities. Roger had convinced Charles that Thomas was envious and untrustworthy, leading Charles to sever ties completely. Now, standing in Thomas's modest apartment, Charles saw the full impact of those manipulations. The realization hit him hard. Roger had not only driven a wedge between them, but had also contributed to the hardships Thomas had faced alone. Charles felt a deep, aching guilt begin to settle in his chest. The brother he had once been so close to, the one he had left behind, had suffered while Charles had thrived. The success Charles had achieved now seemed hollow in the face of what it had cost him. As they stood there, awkward and uncertain, Charles knew this reunion was only the beginning. The past had resurfaced, bringing with it unresolved pain and the need for reconciliation. But for now, the brothers remained trapped in the silence of what was lost, both unsure of how to bridge the gap that had grown between them. The small kitchen was cramped, the table barely big enough for the two of them to sit across from each other. Charles took a sip of the coffee Thomas had offered. It was strong and bitter, a far cry from the artisanal brews he was used to, but the taste was the least of his concerns. The tension between them was palpable, thickening the air as they both struggled to find words. "So," Charles began awkwardly, "how have you been?" Thomas looked down at his hands, rough and calloused from years of manual work. "I've been managing," he replied, his voice low and guarded. "It's been tough since Claire passed." Charles's grip tightened around his mug. He hadn't heard much about Thomas's wife, Claire, over the years. They had met only once, briefly, at a distant family gathering. He'd never even known she had fallen ill. "I'm sorry to hear that," he said, the words feeling inadequate. "What happened?" "Cancer," Thomas said bluntly. "It came on fast. By the time we found out, it was too late to do much. She was gone within a few months." The simplicity of his statement belied the enormity of the loss. Charles couldn't imagine what it had been like, raising Noah alone after losing the woman he loved. He glanced at the boy, who was playing quietly in the living room, oblivious to the heavy conversation in the kitchen. "I can't believe you had to go through that alone," Charles finally said, guilt gnawing at him. "I didn't even know." Thomas shrugged, but there was a tightness in his expression. "We were never really in touch after everything." His words were careful, as though he was afraid to reopen old wounds. The room fell into silence again, broken only by the sound of Noah's toys clattering in the next room. Charles's mind raced with questions about the years they'd lost, about the struggles Thomas had faced without him. But he couldn't bring himself to ask them, not yet. The weight of his own guilt and the realization of how much he'd missed pressed down on him like a physical burden. "Why didn't you ever visit us, Uncle Charles?" Noah's innocent voice cut through the silence like a knife. The boy had wandered back into the kitchen, his big eyes looking up at Charles with a mixture of curiosity and confusion. The question hit Charles with unexpected force, the words echoing in his mind. He felt his heart sink, and for a moment he couldn't find his voice. What could he say to that? How could he explain the years of absence, the pride and ambition that had kept him away? The realization of the pain he had caused, not just to Thomas, but to this innocent child, was overwhelming. "I don't know, Noah," Charles finally stammered, his voice thick with emotion. "I should have. I'm sorry." Noah nodded, accepting the apology with the simple grace that only children possess. But the question lingered in the air, its impact far deeper than the boy could have known. Thomas watched his brother closely, the tension in his face easing slightly. "It wasn't just you," he said quietly. "I didn't reach out either. I didn't think you'd want to hear from me." The words hung between them, heavy with regret. Charles realized how much his silence had cost them both. His brother had suffered, and he had been too wrapped up in his own life to notice. "I was wrong," Charles admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was wrong to let things get this far. I should have been there for you, for both of you." Thomas didn't respond immediately. He simply looked at Charles, as if weighing the sincerity of his words. The years of distance, the pride and hurt that had kept them apart, were not easy to overcome. But in that moment, something shifted between them, a crack in the wall that had divided their lives. "It's not too late," Thomas said finally, the tension in his shoulders easing. "We can still try." Charles nodded, a small, tentative hope flickering within him. It wasn't a full reconciliation, not yet, but it was a start. They still had a long way to go, and the scars of the past wouldn't heal overnight. But for the first time in years, Charles felt that maybe, just maybe, it was possible to mend what had been broken. He cleared his throat, searching for the right words, something that might begin to bridge the gap between them. "Why don't we have breakfast tomorrow?" Charles suggested, his voice softer than before. "All of us. Together. It's been too long, and I think we need to start somewhere." Thomas looked at Charles, his eyes narrowing slightly. It was clear that he was wrestling with mixed emotions, hope, fear, and a deep-seated wariness that had built up over the years. The idea of sharing a meal, something so simple, felt monumental given the distance between them. "I don't know, Charles," Thomas began, but he trailed off, his gaze drifting to Noah, who was watching them with expectant eyes. Charles could see the hesitation in his brother's face. The years of distrust and hurt couldn't be erased with a single gesture. But he also sensed the small glimmer of hope that Thomas might be willing to take a step forward. "It's just breakfast," Charles said, trying to keep his tone light. "No strings attached. We can go somewhere Noah likes." Thomas's defenses wavered. The thought of doing something normal, something as simple as breakfast, was both inviting and terrifying. "All right," he said finally, though the agreement was tinged with caution. "But just breakfast." A small smile tugged at the corners of Charles's mouth. It wasn't much, but it was a start. "Great. How about I pick you both up around 9? Thomas nodded, but there was still a lingering tension between them, an unspoken understanding that this was only the beginning. Charles knew that trust wouldn't be rebuilt overnight, but the fact that Thomas was willing to try was enough for now. That evening, as Charles returned to his penthouse, he couldn't shake the sense of unease that had settled over him. His phone buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. The name on the screen made his heart sink. Roger Whitman. "Charles, I've been hearing some things." Roger's voice crackled through the speaker. "I understand you've reconnected with your brother." Charles tensed, the familiar tone of concern mixed with subtle condescension making his skin crawl. "We've talked," Charles replied cautiously, not wanting to divulge too much. "Are you sure that's wise?" Roger's question was laced with implications. "You've worked hard to get where you are. People like Thomas, well, they might see this as an opportunity. You know what I mean." Charles felt a flicker of anger rise within him. Roger's words, once persuasive and guiding, now felt like poison. "Thomas isn't like that," Charles said, more firmly than he intended. "He's my brother." "Is he?" Roger countered, the challenge clear. "Or is he someone who could jeopardize everything you've built?" The old doubts began to stir within Charles, the same doubts that Roger had planted years ago. But this time, something felt different. The memories of that day with Thomas and Noah, the genuine interactions, were still fresh in his mind. For the first time, Charles found himself questioning Roger's motives rather than Thomas's. "I appreciate your concern, Roger," Charles said carefully, "but I think I can handle this." Roger paused, as if weighing his next words. "Just be careful, Charles. Don't let sentiment cloud your judgment. You've got a lot to lose." As the call ended, Charles stared at the phone in his hand, a sense of clarity beginning to form. Roger's influence had been strong for years, guiding him toward success but away from the people who mattered most. But now, the seeds of doubt Roger had sown felt less like wisdom and more like manipulation. Charles knew he was at a crossroads, not just with Thomas, but with Roger as well. For the first time in years, Charles began to see Roger for what he truly was, a man who thrived on control and who had played a significant role in the rift between the brothers. The realization was sobering, but it also steeled Charles's resolve. He was determined to make things right with Thomas and Noah, even if it meant questioning everything he had built with Roger. Tomorrow's breakfast would be a first step, a small, tentative step toward rebuilding what had been broken. The next morning, Charles found himself pacing the living room of his penthouse, his mind racing with a mix of anticipation and anxiety. He had never felt so uneasy in his own home, a place that had always been a sanctuary of control and predictability. Today, however, the space felt cold and sterile, more a showroom than a place where life was actually lived. He caught his reflection in the glass walls, the city sprawling out behind him, and wondered what Thomas and Noah would think of this place. The intercom buzzed, pulling him out of his thoughts. He took a deep breath and pressed the button, his voice steady despite the nerves. "Come on up." When the elevator doors opened, Thomas stepped out, holding Noah's hand. The contrast between them and their surroundings was stark. Thomas in his worn jacket and faded jeans, and Noah's wide-eyed curiosity as he took in the opulence of the penthouse. The polished marble floors, the sleek, modern furniture, and the expansive views of the city seemed to belong to a different world. "Wow," Noah breathed, his eyes darting around the room. "This place is huge." Charles managed to smile, though he couldn't shake the feeling of unease. "It is," he admitted, feeling the words fall flat. "Come on in." Thomas stepped in cautiously, his gaze sweeping the room. He looked uncomfortable, out of place, and Charles could see the wariness in his eyes. The gulf between their lives was undeniable, and it made the space between them feel even wider. Noah, however, seemed unfazed by the tension. He wandered around, exploring the penthouse with the innocent curiosity that only a child could bring. His laughter echoed in the spacious rooms as he discovered the small things that made Charles's life luxurious. Remote-controlled blinds, a giant television that descended from the ceiling, and a sleek, minimalistic kitchen that looked like it belonged in a magazine. As Noah moved from room to room, he stumbled upon an old, worn-out toy that Charles had forgotten he even owned. It was a small wooden plane, one that had been buried in a box in the corner of the room for years. Noah picked it up, turning it over in his hands with a look of wonder. "Uncle Charles, where did you get this?" Noah asked, holding up the plane. Charles blinked, the sight of the toy jolting a memory loose. That was mine when I was your age," he said, his voice softer. "Your dad and I used to play with it all the time." Thomas looked up at that, a small, bittersweet smile tugging at his lips. "We built that plane together," he recalled, his voice tinged with nostalgia. "Spent an entire weekend working on it, didn't we?" Charles nodded, the memory unfolding like a long-lost photograph. "We did. I remember we couldn't wait to finish it so we could play. We even took it up to the treehouse." Noah's eyes widened. "You had a treehouse?" "We did," Thomas said, his voice warming as he glanced at Charles. "We built it ourselves. It wasn't much, but it was ours." For a moment, the tension between the brothers melted away, replaced by the shared memory of simpler times. The treehouse had been their sanctuary, a place where they had spent countless hours dreaming and playing before the complexities of adult life had driven them apart. The memory was bittersweet, a reminder of the bond they once had and the distance that had grown between them since. Noah, sensing the change in the room's atmosphere, smiled. "I wish I could have seen it." Charles met Thomas's gaze, and for the first time in years, he felt a connection that hadn't been there before. It was fragile, like a thread of light breaking through the darkness, but it was enough to give him hope. "Maybe we can build something together someday," Charles suggested, the words surprising even himself. Thomas didn't reply immediately, but the guarded look in his eyes softened slightly. "Yeah," he said after a moment, "maybe we can." Just as the moment began to settle, the doorbell rang. Charles frowned, not expecting anyone else. He opened the door to find Roger standing there, a disapproving look on his face. "Roger," Charles greeted him, trying to keep his voice neutral. "What are you doing here?" Roger stepped inside, his gaze flicking to Thomas and Noah before settling on Charles. "I wanted to talk to you about something important," he said, his tone pointed, "in private." Charles felt the tension in the room spike again. He glanced at Thomas, who was watching the interaction with a guarded expression. "Whatever it is, Roger, it can wait," Charles replied, his voice firmer than before. Roger's eyes narrowed, clearly not used to being dismissed. "I'm not sure that's wise, Charles. We have business to discuss, and I don't think—" "We're done here, Roger," Charles interrupted, his patience wearing thin. "I'm spending time with my family." Roger looked taken aback, but he quickly masked his surprise with a tight smile. "Very well," he said, but the edge in his voice was unmistakable. "I'll be in touch." As Roger left, the tension in the room slowly dissipated. Charles let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, his resolve hardening. He knew now more than ever that he needed to distance himself from Roger's influence. The visit had only solidified his determination to prioritize his family, no matter how difficult the journey ahead might be. He turned back to Thomas and Noah, a small but genuine smile forming on his lips. "Now, where were we?" Thomas returned the smile, albeit cautiously. "I think we were talking about treehouses." And just like that, the conversation resumed, the bond between the brothers slowly starting to rebuild, one shared memory at a time. Later that week, Charles and Thomas found themselves seated at a small cafe near Thomas's apartment. The morning sun filtered through the windows, casting a warm glow over their table as they sipped their coffee in comfortable silence. It was a stark contrast to their first tense meeting, a sign that the distance between them was slowly narrowing. Thomas cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "Charles, I've been thinking." Charles looked up, sensing the seriousness in his brother's tone. "What's on your mind?" Thomas hesitated for a moment, then spoke. "I know you've offered to help me and Noah, and I appreciate it, but I don't feel right just taking money from you. It's not who I am." Charles opened his mouth to protest, but Thomas held up a hand to stop him. "Hear me out. There's something else you could do that would mean a lot more to me. There's a community center a few blocks from here, small, struggling to keep its doors open. I've been volunteering there for a while now, and it's been a lifeline for me and Noah. It's where I go when things get tough. It's where Noah goes after school. It's become a second home for us." Charles listened intently, his interest piqued. He could see the passion in Thomas's eyes, the way his face softened as he spoke about the community center. It was clear that this place had become more than just a refuge. It was a symbol of hope and resilience for both of them. "What do you need?" Charles asked, his voice steady. "The center needs funding, repairs, new programs. You name it," Thomas replied. "But more than that, it needs someone who can bring attention to it, someone who can help it grow into something that can really make a difference in the community." Charles nodded slowly, the idea taking root in his mind. This was more than just a chance to help his brother. It was an opportunity to do something meaningful, something that went beyond the bottom line of a business deal. "I'll help," he said, the decision coming naturally. "Whatever the center needs, I'm in." Thomas's relief was palpable, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Thank you, Charles. It means a lot." In the days that followed, Charles threw himself into the community center project with a dedication that surprised even him. He used his wealth and influence to secure funding, bring in contractors for repairs, and attract volunteers. The transformation was swift, the center quickly evolving from a rundown building to a vibrant hub of activity. As Charles walked through the newly renovated halls of the center, he felt a sense of fulfillment that had long eluded him. The gratitude in the faces of the families who used the center, the sound of children laughing in the playground, the way the community rallied around this place, it was a far cry from the sterile satisfaction of closing a business deal. For the first time in years, Charles felt like he was part of something larger than himself. The community center had become a place where they could all connect, free from the weight of the past. But not everyone was pleased with Charles's newfound commitment. Roger, who had grown increasingly concerned about Charles's shift in focus, made his displeasure known during a tense meeting at Charles's office. "This community center business," Roger began, his tone clipped, "is it really worth your time? We have deals on the table, opportunities that could make us millions. And you're out there, playing social worker?" Charles met Roger's gaze, feeling the familiar tug of their old dynamic. But this time, something had changed. The allure of wealth and success no longer held the same power over him. "It's worth it, Roger," Charles said firmly. "More than you can imagine." Roger's expression darkened. "You're letting sentiment cloud your judgment, Charles. We built this company together, and now you're risking it all for some pet project?" "It's not just a project," Charles shot back, his patience wearing thin. "It's about making a real difference, something that actually matters." Roger leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. "You're neglecting your responsibilities. You're throwing away everything we've worked for." Charles shook his head, the clarity of his decision solidifying. "No, Roger. I'm just choosing to focus on what's important to me now. And if you can't support that, maybe it's time we reconsider our partnership." The silence that followed was thick with tension, but Charles didn't waver. He knew what he had to do, and for the first time in years, he wasn't afraid to stand up for it. Roger finally rose from his seat, his expression unreadable. "Think about what you're doing, Charles. Don't make a mistake you'll regret." But Charles had already made up his mind. As Roger left, Charles felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The ties that had once bound him to a life of empty success were beginning to unravel, replaced by something far more meaningful. The community center project had not only revitalized the neighborhood, it had begun to revitalize Charles's life as well. And with each step forward, the bond between him and Thomas grew stronger. The possibility of a true reconciliation becoming more real with each passing day. The transformation of the community center was nothing short of remarkable. Where once there had been peeling paint and broken windows, there were now bright murals and gleaming glass. The playground, once a rusted and forgotten corner of the lot, had been replaced with new equipment, its swings and slides echoing with the laughter of children. The center, which had once struggled to stay afloat, was now a hub of activity, buzzing with life and hope. The community began to take notice of their efforts. Local families, once skeptical of the changes, started to get involved. Volunteers streamed in, eager to contribute to the revitalization. The center became a beacon of hope, symbolizing the positive change that was taking place not only within its walls, but also in the lives of those who walked through its doors. One afternoon, as they were finishing up the last of the renovations, Thomas called Charles over to a quiet corner of the newly refurbished center. He seemed unusually reflective, his eyes lingering on the fresh coat of paint that now adorned the walls. "Charles," Thomas began, reaching into his pocket, "there's something I've been meaning to give you." Charles watched as Thomas pulled out a small, weathered box. Inside was a watch, old, with a worn leather strap and a face that had seen better days. Charles recognized it immediately. It was their father's watch, the one he had always worn until the day he passed. "This watch has been passed down through our family for generations," Thomas said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Dad gave it to me when you left for college. I've kept it all these years, waiting for the right time to pass it on." Charles stared at the watch, memories flooding back. He could remember their father wearing it, how he would glance at it during family dinners, how he had once told them it was a reminder that time was precious. The watch was more than just a timepiece. It was a symbol of their family's bond, of the legacy that had been passed down through the generations. "I want you to have it now," Thomas continued, holding the box out to Charles. "I think Dad would have wanted you to have it." For a moment, Charles couldn't speak. The gesture was overwhelming, filled with a significance that words couldn't capture. He reached out and took the box, his hand trembling slightly as he lifted the watch from its velvet cushion. "Thank you, Thomas," Charles finally managed, his voice thick with emotion. This means more to me than I can say." Thomas nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "We're family, Charles. We've lost a lot of time, but maybe we can make up for some of it." Charles slipped the watch onto his wrist, feeling the cool weight of it against his skin. It was a simple thing, but as he looked at it, he felt a deep sense of connection, not just to his father, but to Thomas as well. The watch, once a reminder of time's passing, had now become a symbol of their renewed bond, of the time they still had to share. As the center continued to flourish, so did Charles's connection with Sarah, the center's director. Their relationship developed gradually, built on mutual respect and a shared passion for helping others. Sarah was unlike anyone Charles had ever known, grounded, compassionate, and deeply committed to the community. At first, their interactions were strictly professional. Sarah guided him through the intricacies of running the center, teaching him how to connect with the people who relied on its services. But as they spent more time together, Charles began to see a different side of her, a warmth and kindness that drew him in. Sarah challenged Charles to see beyond his wealth and status, to understand that true success wasn't measured in dollars, but in the impact one had on others. She showed him that love and connection were built on trust, respect, and shared values, not on material possessions. Their relationship grew slowly, like a seed taking root in fertile soil. There were no grand gestures, no declarations of love, just a steady, unfolding connection that deepened with each passing day. Charles found himself looking forward to their conversations, to the way Sarah made him feel, seen, valued, and understood. One evening, after a long day of work at the center, Charles and Sarah found themselves sitting on the steps outside, watching the sun set over the city. The air was warm, the sky painted in hues of orange and pink. "You've done a lot for this place, Charles," Sarah said, breaking the comfortable silence, "for the people here." Charles glanced at her, a soft smile on his lips. "I think it's done more for me." Sarah turned to look at him, her eyes searching his. "You're not the same man who walked in here a few months ago. I've seen you change. You've become, well, more yourself." Her words struck a chord deep within him. For so long, Charles had been lost in the pursuit of success, measuring his worth by the size of his bank account. But now, sitting beside Sarah, he felt a different kind of wealth, one that couldn't be quantified, but that filled him with a quiet, lasting contentment. "Maybe I'm finally figuring out what really matters," Charles said, his voice soft but sure. Sarah smiled, and in that moment, Charles knew that he was no longer just living a life of success. He was beginning to live a life of meaning. The day of the grand reopening arrived with clear skies and a sense of anticipation that buzzed through the air. The once rundown community center now stood proudly, its new facade gleaming in the morning sunlight. Banners fluttered in the breeze, and the laughter of children filled the air as families and volunteers gathered to celebrate the culmination of months of hard work. Charles stood near the entrance, watching as people streamed in, their faces alight with joy and curiosity. It was a momentous occasion, one that marked not only the transformation of the center, but also the change within himself. The center had become more than just a project. It was a symbol of the power of collaboration, of what could be achieved when people came together with a shared purpose. Thomas was beside him, a quiet pride in his eyes as he greeted familiar faces from the community. Noah darted around them, his excitement infectious as he showed off the new playground to his friends. The atmosphere was filled with hope, a tangible sense that this place, this community, was on the verge of something new and better. As the crowd gathered around the stage set up in front of the center, Charles felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to see Sarah, her warm smile reassuring him as she nodded toward the microphone. It was time. Taking a deep breath, Charles stepped forward, his heart pounding with a mix of nerves and anticipation. He had given countless speeches in his career, but this one felt different, more personal, more important. "Thank you all for being here today," Charles began, his voice carrying over the crowd. "Today, we're not just reopening a building. We're celebrating a community that has shown incredible resilience, strength, and spirit." He paused, scanning the faces before him, many of whom he had come to know over the past months. "When I first got involved with this project, I didn't fully understand what it meant to give back. I thought I could help by simply writing a check, by using my resources to make things better. But I've learned that true wealth isn't measured by what we have, it's measured by what we give, by the relationships we build, and by the impact we have on those around us." Charles felt a swell of emotion as he glanced at Thomas, who stood off to the side, watching him with a mixture of pride and something deeper, an understanding that they had both come a long way. "I want to thank my brother Thomas," Charles continued, his voice thick with gratitude. "He showed me the true meaning of wealth, not in dollars, but in love, in family, and in community. Without him, I wouldn't be standing here today, and this center wouldn't be the place of hope and connection that it is now." The crowd erupted in applause, the sound washing over Charles like a wave of affirmation. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle into something profound and lasting. But as the applause began to die down, Charles noticed a familiar figure making his way through the crowd. Roger. His presence was like a dark cloud on an otherwise perfect day. Roger's face was set in a determined expression, and Charles knew what was coming, a final attempt to pull him back into the world he had left behind. Roger reached the stage just as Charles stepped down, a forced smile on his face. "Charles, we need to talk," he said, his voice low but urgent. Charles sighed, his earlier sense of peace threatened by Roger's presence. "Not now, Roger. I'm in the middle of something important." "This is important too," Roger insisted, his tone growing more insistent. "I know you've been distracted, caught up in this community center business, but there are things you need to know. Thomas, he's had financial issues, serious ones. If word gets out, it could discredit everything you've worked for here." The threat hung in the air, cold and sharp. For a moment, Charles felt the old doubts stir, the fear of losing what he had built, of being dragged back into the shadows of his past. But then he looked out at the crowd, at the people who had come together to celebrate something far more valuable than any business deal. Charles turned back to Roger, his decision clear. "No, Roger," he said firmly. "I'm not going down that road again. Thomas's past doesn't matter. What matters is what we're building here, together." Roger's eyes narrowed, his frustration evident. "You're making a mistake, Charles. You're throwing away everything we worked for." "No, Roger," Charles replied, his voice steady. "I'm finally doing something that matters. And if you can't see that, then maybe it's time we went our separate ways." Roger opened his mouth to argue, but Charles held up a hand, cutting him off. "I've made my choice. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a celebration to get back to." With that, Charles turned away, leaving Roger standing alone in the crowd. The weight of the decision lifted as he walked back to his family, a sense of peace settling over him. He knew that he had chosen the right path, the path that led to love, to family, and to a community that had given him more than he could have ever imagined. As the celebration continued, Charles stood with Thomas, Noah, and Sarah, surrounded by the warmth and joy of the people they had brought together. In that moment, he realized that he had found something far more valuable than success. He had found a place where he truly belonged. The bond between Charles and Thomas had never been stronger. They spent nearly every day together, whether working at the community center or simply enjoying each other's company. It felt as though they had finally reclaimed the years lost to misunderstanding and pride. But just as things seemed to be settling into a new, peaceful rhythm, a shadow fell over their lives. It started with a cough, just a small, persistent tickle in Thomas's throat that he brushed off as nothing. But as weeks passed, the cough worsened, accompanied by bouts of fatigue that left Thomas unusually drained. Concerned, Charles insisted on taking him to see a doctor. The visit was supposed to be routine, but the news they received was anything but. The diagnosis was swift and brutal. Thomas had an aggressive form of cancer, the same illness that had taken his wife. The doctor's words echoed in Charles's mind like a cruel reminder of their mother's battle with the disease, a battle she had ultimately lost. It felt as though history was repeating itself in the most devastating way possible. Charles was crushed, a deep, gnawing guilt settling in his chest. The years he had spent estranged from Thomas now felt like a bitter waste, time they could never get back. He had only just begun to rebuild their relationship, and now, cruelly, that time was being cut short. But alongside the guilt came a fierce determination. Charles resolved to make the most of whatever time they had left. He put everything else aside, including his business, to be with Thomas and Noah. Days turned into weeks as Charles devoted himself to supporting his brother, refusing to let the gravity of the situation pull them apart. They spent hours together, sharing quiet, poignant moments, reminiscing about their childhood, making plans for Noah's future, and most importantly, saying the things that had gone unsaid for too many years. Despite the best medical care, Thomas's condition worsened rapidly. The illness progressed with a relentless speed, sapping his strength day by day. But even as his body weakened, Thomas remained resolute, his spirit unbroken. He often joked with Charles, trying to keep the mood light, but there was a seriousness in his eyes that betrayed the gravity of the situation. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the room in a warm golden light, Thomas asked Charles to sit with him. His voice was softer than usual, tinged with a vulnerability that Charles hadn't heard before. "Charles," Thomas began, his hand reaching out to grasp his brother's. "There's something I need to say, before it's too late." Charles's throat tightened, but he nodded, squeezing Thomas's hand in silent support. "I've always looked up to you," Thomas continued, his voice steady despite the emotion behind it. "Even when we were apart, I never stopped thinking of you as my big brother. I want you to know, I'm proud of the man you've become. I wish we had more time." Tears welled up in Charles's eyes, but he forced himself to stay strong, for Thomas's sake. "We've got time now," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We're making the most of it." Thomas smiled, but there was a sadness in his eyes that couldn't be ignored. "I need you to do something for me, Charles," he said, his grip tightening slightly. "Promise me you'll take care of Noah. Make sure he grows up with the same strength and love that we had, and that he knows how much I love him." Charles nodded, his tears finally spilling over. "I promise, Thomas. I'll take care of him. He'll always know how much you loved him." Satisfied, Thomas leaned back against his pillows, his face relaxed despite the pain. "Thank you," he whispered, his eyes closing as exhaustion took over. "You've always been there for me, Charles, even when I didn't realize it." In that moment, as the room grew quiet, Charles felt a deep, aching love for his brother, a love that had been buried for too long but had finally been allowed to surface. He stayed by Thomas's side, holding his hand until he drifted off to sleep. Thomas passed away a few days later, quietly, in the early hours of the morning. The loss left a deep void in Charles's life, one that could never be filled. But alongside the grief was a renewed sense of purpose. Charles had promised to care for Noah, and he intended to keep that promise with every fiber of his being. As he stood by Thomas's graveside, holding Noah close, Charles knew that his brother's legacy would live on, not just in the community center they had rebuilt together, but in the love and strength that Thomas had instilled in those around him. And in that, Charles found a small measure of peace, knowing that he would carry on Thomas's spirit in everything he did. Thomas's funeral was a somber affair, the kind that leaves a heavy silence in its wake. The small church was filled with friends, family, and members of the community, people whose lives Thomas had touched in quiet, meaningful ways. The air was thick with grief, but also with the unspoken gratitude for the man they had all known and loved. Charles stood at the front, his hand resting on Noah's shoulder as they faced the gathered mourners. The weight of the responsibility Thomas had entrusted to him felt heavier than ever, but Charles was determined to carry it with the same quiet strength that had defined his brother's life. When it came time to speak, Charles stepped forward, his voice steady despite the emotion that gripped his heart. Thomas was a man of quiet strength, of deep love, and of unwavering dedication to those he cared about, he began, his words resonating through the small church. He wasn't the type to seek the spotlight, but he made a difference in so many lives, just by being who he was. Charles paused, looking out at the faces before him, people who had come to pay their respects to a man who had left a lasting impact on their lives. Thomas taught me that true wealth isn't measured by what we accumulate, but by what we give. He showed me the importance of family, of community, and of standing by those we love, no matter the cost. He glanced down at Noah, who looked up at him with eyes that were still red from crying, but filled with trust. "I promise to carry on Thomas's legacy," Charles continued, his voice firm with resolve, "to support the community center he loved, to help those in need, and to be the father figure Noah deserves. Thomas may be gone, but his spirit will live on in all of us." The eulogy was met with a wave of quiet, respectful applause, and as Charles returned to his seat, he felt a deep sense of connection to the people around him, a connection that had been missing from his life for far too long. In the weeks that followed, Charles threw himself into continuing the work that Thomas had started. The community center was renamed in Thomas's honor, a lasting tribute to his life and the values he had stood for. Under Charles's guidance, the center expanded its programs, reaching even more families in need and becoming a beacon of hope in the community. At the same time, Charles stepped into the role of a father figure for Noah, guiding him through his grief and helping him navigate the challenges of growing up without his parents. They spent countless hours together, talking, laughing, and finding solace in each other's company. Charles found a new kind of fulfillment in being there for Noah, something he had never truly experienced with his own children. The bond between them deepened, and Charles knew that he was honoring Thomas's final wish in the best way he could. As Charles embraced this new chapter of his life, he also began to distance himself from Roger. The man who had once been his mentor and business partner had become a symbol of the life Charles no longer wanted. Eventually, Roger left the company, marking the final break from the past that had kept Charles trapped in a cycle of empty success. In moments of quiet reflection, Charles often found himself thinking about the journey he had taken, from a lonely millionaire, disconnected from those around him, to a man deeply involved in his community, with a clear sense of purpose and connection. He had lost his brother, but in doing so, he had found himself and the life he was meant to live. Charles knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he also knew that he wasn't walking it alone. He had Noah by his side, a community that supported him, and the enduring legacy of his brother to guide him. And in that, he found a peace that he had never thought possible. Years passed, and the community center continued to thrive, becoming a beacon of hope and support for the neighborhood. The once struggling building was now a vibrant hub of activity, filled with laughter, learning, and the warmth of a close-knit community. Its walls were adorned with murals that told the story of the center's transformation, a testament to the power of love, perseverance, and the human spirit. Noah, now a young adult, walked through the halls of the center with the same quiet confidence that had once defined his father. He had grown into a compassionate and driven man, deeply committed to carrying on the legacy of both his father and his uncle. His days were spent organizing programs, mentoring young people, and ensuring that the center remained a place where everyone felt welcome and valued. Charles, now older and a bit slower in his step, watched Noah with a deep sense of pride. He saw in him the best parts of Thomas, the strength, the kindness, and the unwavering dedication to those he cared about. But there was also something more. Noah had a vision, a drive to take the work they had started to new heights, to make an even greater impact on the community. Beside Charles stood Sarah, her presence a comforting constant in his life. Over the years, their relationship had deepened into a partnership built on mutual respect, shared values, and love. Sarah had been a guiding force for both Charles and Noah, her wisdom and compassion helping them navigate the challenges that came with running the center and dealing with the loss of Thomas. It was a full-circle moment for Charles, a realization that the choices he, Thomas, and Sarah had made would continue to ripple through future generations. The love and lessons they had imparted to Noah were now guiding him as he shaped the future of the center, and by extension, the lives of countless others. One afternoon, as the sun cast a warm glow over the community center, Charles found himself sitting in a quiet corner with Sarah, observing the bustling activity around them. Children played in the courtyard, their laughter filling the air, while volunteers worked together to prepare for an evening event. Noah was in the middle of it all, his presence a steady, reassuring force that brought people together. Charles glanced at Sarah, who smiled warmly at him, her eyes reflecting the same sense of fulfillment he felt. As he watched Noah, a deep sense of peace settled over Charles. He had spent so many years chasing wealth, status, and success, only to discover that true fulfillment came from the relationships he nurtured and the legacy he left behind. Thomas's passing had been a painful loss, but it had also given Charles the gift of understanding what truly mattered in life. Charles Grayson, once a lonely millionaire, discovered that true wealth lies in the relationships we nurture and the legacies we leave behind, he reflected quietly, sharing the thought with Sarah. His brother's passing taught him that life's greatest treasures cannot be measured in dollars, but in the love and impact we share. Sarah squeezed his hand gently, her presence a reassuring reminder of how far they had all come. As the day turned to dusk, Charles felt content, knowing that he had finally found his place in the world, a place where he was surrounded by love, community, and a sense of purpose that would endure long after he was gone. And in that moment, as he sat beside the woman he loved and watched the young man they had helped raise, he knew that he had truly lived.